Alexandra Feodorovna, Empress of Russia, spent the calmest and most settled years of her married life inside a pale yellow palace on the edge of Tsarskoye Selo, a name that translates simply as the Tsar's Village, about 15 miles south of St. Petersburg. The building was the Alexander Palace, built in the 1790s by Catherine the Great as a wedding gift for her grandson, and it was here, rather than in the vast ceremonial halls of the Winter Palace in the capital, that Nicholas II and his wife chose to raise their 5 children and live what both of them, in letters to friends, called a private life. Alexandra had not been raised to expect a throne. She had been born Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine, a minor German princess who spent much of her childhood in England under the personal supervision of her grandmother, Queen Victoria, after her own mother died when Alex was 6 years old. She grew into a tall, reserved young woman, striking enough that nearly everyone who met her commented on her looks, but so uneasy in front of strangers that many mistook her natural shyness for coldness. That English upbringing, quiet, orderly, and shielded from public display, shaped almost everything about how she chose to spend her mornings once she became the wife of a man who ruled over 130 million subjects. What did those private hours actually look like, behind the public image of jewels and ceremony that most of her subjects associated with an empress? The empress's bedroom occupied the ground floor of the palace's eastern wing, a placement chosen out of necessity rather than taste. Alexandra had suffered from heart trouble for years, a condition her physicians described as an enlarged heart with an irregular pulse, and by the time her son was born in 1904, the effort of climbing even a single staircase left her short of breath. So the bedroom she shared with Nicholas was set at ground level, a large room with 2 tall windows looking out over the palace park, allowing her to see trees and open lawn without leaving the room at all. A large bed of pale wood stood between the windows, with her dressing table close beside it. The furniture was upholstered in a flowered tapestry fabric, and a plain, soft, undyed carpet covered the floor, chosen for comfort rather than for display. She woke later than a strictly run household of the period would have expected, and this too traced back to her heart. Her doctors had told her to rest as long as her body needed each morning, so unlike her husband, who kept to a fixed early schedule of work, the Empress's waking hour shifted according to how she had slept and how her chest and legs felt on a given day. On difficult mornings, after a night spent awake with pain running through her legs, a symptom of the sciatica that had troubled her since her teenage years, she stayed in bed for long stretches, propped against pillows, working through letters before she had even dressed. On the worst morning, she moved only with the help of a wheelchair kept near the room for exactly that purpose. The pattern repeated itself most severely in the aftermath of any crisis involving her son's health. After a bad bleeding episode, of which there would be several over the years, she tended to collapse for weeks afterward, largely confined to a couch until her own strength slowly returned. On steadier mornings, she rose earlier, unassisted, and made her own way across the corridor to bathe before anyone else in the household had seen her. Most mornings began with a small dose of Adonis vernalis, an herbal remedy made from a wildflower that she took to help regulate her pulse, a routine repeated so often over the years that her household simply came to think of it as part of getting up. Just to the right of the bed, a small door in the wall led into a private chapel, lit by hanging lamps, holding only a Bible and an icon of Christ set on a low stand. It was here that the Empress prayed each morning before the rest of her day began. Her conversion to Orthodoxy, required before her marriage in 1894, had not been undertaken lightly, and by every account from the people who lived and worked around her, she absorbed the faith with an intensity well beyond what court tradition expected of a German-born consort. She spent long stretches on her knees in prayer, venerated the saints of the Orthodox calendar with real devotion, and kept candles burning before the icons placed throughout her private rooms. For a woman who found most of public court life a source of genuine anxiety, this narrow chapel beside her bed functioned as one of the only places in the entire palace where she felt fully at ease. Once she had bathed and prayed, the work of dressing began, and here the household's actual routine differed sharply from what the wider Russian public imagined about court life. The Empress employed 6 dressers whose task was to help her into her clothes and arrange her hair, working on a strict 3-day rotation so that no single woman was on duty for more than a few days running. The two most senior were Madeline Zanotti, Italian by birth, whose family had served the House of Hesse for generations before Alexandra's marriage, and Louise Tegleva, known in the household as Tutel, who came from the Baltic provinces. Despite their constant closeness to the Empress, none of the 6 women ever saw her unclothed or in her bath. She bathed and undressed entirely alone, then put on a plain kimono of silk or printed cotton over her underclothes before calling the dressers in to arrange her hair. Her own household connected the habit directly to her English upbringing, an old-fashioned sense of privacy about the body closer to Windsor or Buckingham Palace in the 1840s than to the fashions of her own era. A fireplace kept the dressing room warm through the winter months, and a separate room, tucked halfway up the staircase leading to the nursery floor, was set aside entirely for ironing and mending her clothes, staffed by maids whose sole responsibility was keeping the Empress's wardrobe in order. Her hairdressing was its own specialized task. Her hair was a deep, reddish gold, and she refused to let it be touched with curling irons, so on most mornings it was arranged simply and pinned close, without the elaborate curled styles fashionable elsewhere at the Russian court. Only major state ceremonies called for anything more elaborate. Once her hair was finished, she chose her clothes for the morning, and again the difference between her private habits and public expectation was considerable. She had access to a fortune in court gowns and family jewels, some among the most valuable in Europe, yet on an ordinary morning she reached for a plain blouse and skirt, or one of the loose, unstructured tea gowns she favored, almost always in blue or mauve, the two colors she returned to for nearly everything she owned outside formal occasions. Her shoes were low-heeled and pointed, made of suede bronze-colored leather or white kid. She avoided satin entirely, telling one of her ladies that the material simply made her uncomfortable. She wore a ring set with a single large pearl and a jeweled cross that rarely left her hands and throat, though her nails were never polished, a small accommodation to her husband, who disliked the fashion. Before leaving her dressing room, she nearly always picked up a piece of needlework, embroidery or knitting she would carry through the rest of the day, a habit formed in childhood under the influence of Queen Victoria, who held that the hands of royal women should never sit entirely idle. By 9 o'clock, dressed and ready, the Empress went to breakfast with her husband. Those who shared the table described it as a simple meal, served in the English style her mother's family had favored, without the many courses associated with a grand continental breakfast. Depending on the season, the couple took it in one of several smaller rooms scattered through the private wing, rather than any single fixed breakfast room. The Emperor disliked being tied to one setting for meals, and the two of them ate some mornings in a corner sitting room, other mornings in a room more often used for billiards, and outdoors on a balcony whenever the weather allowed it. Their private diaries, kept independently by husband and wife across these years, describe mornings filled with the same small details found in any comfortable household's routine. News exchanged over tea, plans discussed for the day ahead, an occasional visit from a gardener carrying flowers, or a groundskeeper with some question about the grounds. After breakfast, the Empress went to see her children, riding a small hydraulic lift installed in 1899 to connect her private suite directly with their rooms on the floor above. Climbing 2 flights of stairs was, by then, more than her heart could reliably manage, and the lift meant she never had to choose between her own health and seeing her children each morning. Upstairs lived her son, Alexei, born in 1904 after 4 daughters, at a time when the family and much of the country had spent years hoping for a son, together with his 4 sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, girls close enough in age that visitors often struggled to tell them apart. Each morning brought a slightly different scene depending on the day and the children's ages. Sometimes the 2 eldest girls at their French lessons with Pierre Guillard, the Swiss tutor first engaged to teach Olga and Tatiana when they were 10 and 8 years old, lessons the Empress herself sat in on during their first weeks together in order to judge the quality of his teaching before leaving him to it. Sometimes Alexei at work with his English tutor, Sidney Gibbes, or with Gilliard, who, over the following years, took on a growing share of the boys' general education as well. The girls worked through French, English, history, scripture, and needlework under their own governesses in rooms decorated simply in green and white, the two eldest sharing one bedroom and the two youngest another, all four sleeping by a family custom dating back roughly a century to the reign of Alexander the Certes, on plain camp beds rather than anything more comfortable, regardless of how much wealth surrounded them. The Empress's visits to this floor were rarely brief. Somewhere in the private wing was a room every child raised there for decades had loved, a playroom with a long wooden slide built into the wall, known in the household as the Mountain Hall, and she was known to sit on the floor there with her children rather than remain at any formal distance, an informality that startled more traditional visitors when they happened to witness it. Pierre Gilliard, who spent years inside the household, wrote afterward that family life at Tsarskoye Selo struck him as far less formal than at any other imperial residence he had known, with the family gathering for meals with no attendants present unless relatives happened to be visiting. Alexei, in particular, treated his mother's morning visit as the center of his day. Those who observed the two of them together consistently described a closeness that went beyond ordinary maternal affection, tied in part to his hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that made any fall or bruise a source of real danger, and to the private, lasting guilt the Empress carried over, having passed the condition to him through her own family line. Even at this hour, a visitor could usually tell the four girls apart by temperament faster than by face. Olga, the eldest, was serious, bookish, and the most independent-minded of the four. Tatiana, tall and more reserved, ran the nursery with such a practical, organizing hand that her younger sisters nicknamed her the governess, and it was Tatiana, more than any of her sisters, who spent the most time simply sitting with her mother. Maria was even-tempered and a little plump, a favorite target of gentle teasing from her parents. Anastasia, the youngest, was the household's acknowledged comedian, quick with a joke and a talent for imitating the adults around her. Alexei, surrounded on all sides by sisters, kept a small menagerie of pets in his rooms, and a private hoard of odds and ends he refused to give up, a trait his father found endlessly amusing. The whole family, the Empress included, was fond of photography, and the children in particular carried small Kodak cameras of their own, filling album after album with pictures of one another. Some of the Empress's own photographs were taken from the palace's L-shaped iron balcony, reached through the maple drawing room, which had become a favorite setting for these informal family portraits since its construction in the late 1890s. Once she had returned downstairs, the middle part of the Empress's morning tended to belong to two things: her closest friend and her writing desk. Anna Virubova, 12 years younger than the Empress and first brought to court as a temporary lady-in-waiting in 1905, had by these years become the one person outside the family the Empress saw almost daily. The two had first taken real notice of each other years earlier, when Anna, still a teenager, fell dangerously ill with typhoid. The Empress, whose household already had a connection to Anna's father, the head of the Emperor's private chancellery, visited her repeatedly during the illness and grew fond of the girl long before she ever held any formal position at court. By these years, Anna was arriving at the palace most mornings to sit with her, read with her, or simply keep her company while she worked through her correspondence. Court society disapproved of the friendship almost from the start, partly because Virubova was neither especially clever nor especially well-connected, and partly because the sheer regularity of her visits meant the household had come to treat her almost as a family member, inviting her even on the family's private cruises aboard the imperial yacht, an honor rarely extended beyond a small circle of senior staff. Whatever time remained before lunch, the Empress generally gave to letters. She kept a writing table in her favorite room, a chamber the household referred to, in the French still used for such things at court, as Le Cabinet Mauve de l'Impératrice, the Empress's mauve room, with the table positioned at an angle in front of the window. Just as often she was found writing with a pad balanced on her lap, seated wherever in the palace she happened to be at that moment. She wrote almost exclusively with a fountain pen, on plain stationery marked only with her personal cipher and the imperial crown, corresponding daily in the years before the war with friends and family scattered across Germany and England. She also kept a private diary, a habit she maintained for essentially her entire adult life, recording the weather, her health, small daily events, and prayers, often in a mixture of English and Russian. The mauve room itself, named for the pale purple-pink color she loved above every other, was filled with fresh lilac and lily of the valley shipped in daily from greenhouses on the French Riviera, even during the depths of the Russian winter. It was here, more than in any of the palace's larger and more formal rooms, that the Empress did most of her thinking, resting on a chaise longue set behind a low wood and glass screen beside a large planter of fragrant flowering plants kept there throughout the year. Not every morning was given entirely to family and letters. When matters of state or court business could not wait, the Empress received officials and petitioners in these late morning hours rather than the afternoon, though she preferred, whenever she had the choice, to keep her mornings free of formal audiences and push that kind of business later in the day. On mornings when she was free of such obligations and felt well enough, she often turned to one of two projects she had built largely on her own initiative. The first, a network of workshops she founded in 1896 under the name Help Through Handwork, brought noblewomen together to teach sewing to poor peasant women with the finished garments sold to raise money for families in need. It was, by her own explicit rule, work that had to be carried out with the members' own hands rather than simply funded from a distance, a condition much of St. Petersburg society, more accustomed to charity conducted through donations and committees, found close to ridiculous. The second was a training college for domestic nurses, organized entirely along English lines she remembered from her own childhood, reflecting her conviction that professionally trained nursing staff, rather than untrained servants, produced healthier children and better-run households. She visited and inspected the college in person whenever her schedule and her health allowed it, walking the wards and asking after specific students by name. Even in these small freedoms, the Empress operated inside a set of unwritten rules she had little power to change, autocrat's wife or not. She could not, for instance, walk into a shop in St. Petersburg itself. Court tradition held that an empress did not appear there as an ordinary customer, though the smaller towns of Tsarskoye Selo and Yalta were considered informal enough that she was permitted to shop there in person. She could not drive herself alone through the streets in an open carriage anywhere except at Peterhof, where a precedent set decades earlier by an 18th-century predecessor had, by long tradition, made the practice acceptable there and nowhere else. When she first began attending church accompanied only by her daughters, without a wider court escort, the small departure from custom was enough to provoke gossip among the older families of the aristocracy. Visitors familiar with the English or German courts sometimes noted that the Alexandra Palace kept far more household staff on hand than its daily work actually required, all maintained under routines the Empress herself was largely powerless to simplify, down to how many servants stood ready for tasks a much smaller staff could easily have managed alone. The Empress's relationship with money followed a similar pattern of restraint inside a setting built for extravagance. She managed her own household accounts with the same careful attention a merchant's wife might have given hers, disliked not knowing the cost of things, and reused her formal gowns for years rather than ordering new ones each season. In later years, once the war had begun, she went so far as to direct her entire clothing allowance, and that of her daughters, toward charitable causes rather than new dresses, a decision that left her, by her own household's account, occasionally short of anything presentable to wear to a function that demanded it. The jewels she wore on an ordinary morning were rarely the enormous state gems associated with Russian empresses in the public imagination. Those larger pieces belonged by tradition to the crown itself, reserved for the wife of the reigning Tsar and set to pass, in time, to the wife of her own son. Her personal preference ran instead to two comparatively modest stones, amethyst and aquamarine, chosen and worn simply because she liked them. As late morning continued, attention in the household turned toward the coming meal. Lunch was generally served at 1 o'clock or 12:30 on Sundays, after the family had attended the morning church service together. On days when her health had been poor, which happened often enough that the household had a settled way of handling it, the Empress skipped the family table altogether and took the meal in her mauve room instead, sometimes entirely alone, sometimes with only Alexei for company, a tray brought to her much as it might have been brought to any invalid confined to her own rooms rather than to the wife of an emperor. It was a quiet way to close a quiet stretch of hours, almost entirely unwitnessed by the wider public, who spent those same mornings imagining an empress surrounded by ceremony and extravagance. Inside the Alexandra Palace, in the years before the war that would soon bring this way of life to an end, Alexandra Feodorovna spent most of her mornings on her heart condition, her small chapel, her children upstairs, and a modest set of letters and handwork carried out largely in private in rooms she had furnished and arranged herself, according to an idea of home she had carried with her since a childhood spent far from any throne.